Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have all of you in this webinar. Today, we are glad to launch the English version of the book Lobbying Uncovered, Corruption, Democracy, and Public Policy in Brazil. This book results from a project born in 2015 to discuss lobbying in Brazil and its consequences. Woodrow Wilson Center, INSPER, and Fundação Brava supported it from the beginning and made it a reality. We say the same about Jota and its effort to raise awareness on the issue. Since day one, our goal for the project was to debate and deepen knowledge about the relationship between private companies and Brazil's public sector. We seek to understand if this relationship is essential or not for the future of the country. We have also discussed that would happen without lobbying activities, if it is feasible. In the second part of the book, we present some suggestions on how to make this relationship between public and private actors possible, while looking at society's best interests. Definitely, we are talking about interests, and there are three interest groups involved in this relationship. When representatives of private companies met government officials, the subject they discuss is of great interest to society. People are used to saying that those who are not seated at the table are usually on the menu. To reflect on these facets, we invited several authors who gave us the honor of participating in the project. They are Alana Rizzo, Aldo Musacchio, Ana Prusa, Carlos Melo, João Manuel Pinho de Melo, Joel Velasco, Luciano Inácio de Souza, Matheus Afonso Bandeira, Matthew Taylor, Nelson Jobim, Paulo Sotero, Sérgio Lazzarini, in addition to Fernando Melo, who was the editor of the text and together with me organized the work. Editora Record published the Portuguese version of the book in early 2018. We are very proud to know that professionals and academics have consulted and quoted the book and are still doing it. In the same period, Jota launched the column As Claras to debate lobbying in Brazil and the relationship between the private sector's influence on public policy, corruption, and the path that the democratic regime has followed in our country. Now, the Woodrow Wilson Center is editing, and we are here to launch the English version of this book. It has the same content released in 2018 with a new chapter written by Fernando Melo. The new topic presents predictive models about the world of politics based on artificial intelligence. I'm pleased to have some authors with us for this webinar, such as Ana Prusa, Fernando Melo, Joel Velasco, Matthew Taylor, and Paulo Sotero. I greet them, and I'm going now to hand the floor to my colleagues for their initial presentations. I also ask the audience to submit questions live via the chat on the Wilson Center's website and on Jota YouTube channel. We can also collect the questions sent to the Wilson Center's email and Twitter that are in the website, brazil@wilsoncenters.org and BrazilInst in the Twitter. Immediately, I will hand the floor over to Fernando Melo, our editor.
Thank you, Milton. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I will make some brief remarks. When we started discussing this project around 2015, 2016, the idea of a bill regularizing lobbying in Brazil was hot. People were discussing that, right? We have a project that was ready to go on the floor. We were conducting some surveys with deputies, and the support for that bill was always around 50%, 60% among congressmen, right? It was also a moment when we have Lava Jato operation going really, really strong, right? And so this discussion was there and was very strong in Congress also. Well, the bill was not transforming into, the project was not voted and was not transforming into a bill, right? So we're still in the same situation in terms of having a bill that talks about this relationship and that regularized law in Brazil, right? And what is the current situation of that bill? We have this artificial intelligence model that we use and that we talked about in the last chapter, that we developed using over 3,000 variables, looking into the characteristics, the meta characteristics of projects in Congress, right? And we can see that this project, it varies a lot on its chance, right, to become a bill. Today, it's around 49.8%. We can see that it increased over the past few weeks because the project started to run over again. There are some movements in the project, right? But 50%, as we know, is something that we can go forward or not. And the history shows that this project, it gets some traction at some point, and then it will not go further, right? And so what we need to see is, well, what will happen at this point? Brazilian Congress is only voting on pandemic issues, on health issues. And so I don't see this project going forward in the next few months, maybe next year, right? Another thing that I find important to say is that when we look at the data, the number of organizations and the number of lobbying organizations, even though they are not official, registered in Congress in Brazil exploded after the Lava Jato and after 2016, and especially 2018. If we take a look at this data, we can see that until 2018, it was always under 300 organizations that registered to work in Congress and actually registered to have meetings with congressmen and congresswomen. After 2019, this number is over 900. It's also interesting to see that it exploded in the number of journalists being registered. And when we see the actual registration of this data, we can see that some organizations actually register journalists, and they are actually not from journalist companies, right? And so what we can see is that organizations are registered and are seeking more participation in Congress, or at least more transparency registration, right? And so that's the current state of the discussion. And in the book, we try to attack the various aspects of this important discussion in Brazil, including corruption, the corruption control, and the institutions that control corruption in Brazil. And I think that there is a correlation there between this number of people registering and the corruption case that emerged after the Lava Jato case. That was my initial remark, Milton. I just wanted to share where I think the discussion is right now. 50% of chance, it went up in the past few weeks, but I don't see this going to the floor very soon. And we have to remember that the first projects, actually the first bill presented to have a lobbying legislation in Brazil was during the military dictatorship. And after that, Marco Maciel, the former vice president, he presented bills in the 90s. And so we are way over 30 years in this discussion, right? And we have to see if this project gets traction again next year.
Thank you, Fernando. I will give the floor to Joel Velasco, but first I would like to say that Joel Velasco it's more than a pleasure to have Joel with us, because Joel is an American with experience. He worked in White House and worked in the lobby industry. But Joel was born in Goiás, in Brazil. That's fantastic. So, Joel, please make your comments for our pleasure.
Thank you, Milton. Actually, as some people know, I grew up in Goiás, but I was born, even some would say worse or better, in Mississippi. So, you know, you can decide whether that's an upgrade or a downgrade, depending on your preference. But yes, I hail from the small town of Anápolis, Goiás, which for a brief moment was famous because it created a lot of executives. It has also now become a bit famous for having quite a few questionable characters. So I think it just reminds you that only time can tell where things stand. Great to be with you all. I should say my colleague Alana Hizu and I co-wrote this article, one of the articles here, which the headline is really, "Can Companies Move Away from Crony Capitalism and Embrace Integrity in Government Relations?" And both of us would say, if Alana were here today as well, she would say we're speaking on our personal capacity, but really from our experience, both as practitioners, but also in her case as a journalist who has seen the impact of, let's call it corruption, lobbying done wrong, however you want to put it. To answer sort of the question of the article, you know, if you could answer in one word, the answer is yes. In fact, I would say companies don't, the answer is not can they, it's they must make that transition. Otherwise, honestly, I think in this day and age, they cannot be sustainable. And I'm not referring to just environmentally sustainable. I'm actually talking about sustainable in terms of financial, but also in terms of being accepted by society as a legitimate actor in the place. The article, you know, we begin and I use in the quote that so many people have used, but I always loved those of Justice Brandeis here in the United States, who back in 1913 said publicity is justly commended as a remedy for social and industrial diseases. Sunlight is said to be the best disinfectant. Electric light is the most efficient policeman. While he doesn't use the word there, what he's really talking about is the need for transparency. And to us, transparency is at the core of, at least Alana and my view, is that transparency is at the core of helping companies make this move from crony capitalism to integrity in government relations. In the paper, we talked about, we want to make clear, I don't believe, and neither does Alana, and I think everybody probably on this panel believes that lobbying is corruption. Corruption can utilize lobbying, advocacy to perpetrate its improprieties. What we really focus on is this term crony capitalism, which to us, you know, is a little bit more of an academic approach, but at the end of the day, it is when companies' success are actually intrinsically tied to the favoritism that they get from government. In other words, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. You know, you vote for me, I pay this bribe. That's obviously when capitalism is wrong. Should say that the solution, and that's probably where I would wrap it up now in the article, and what we talk about is that at the core of this, and this goes back to Justice Brandeis, is that in the case of sunlight, but really transparency is really what's going to make us reduce the chances of corruption. Corruption is always going to exist. Crime is always going to exist. What I think we need to think about is how do we build structures. There's not going to be, you know, as Fernando was talking about legislating on this, there's not going to be a law that's going to, you know, you can prohibit corruption, but it's not going to be a law that's going to stop that. You can have a law or not have a law on lobbying, but it's going to exist. We're all humans. We're going to advocate for our positions. What we think is what Brazil's particular experience with Lava Jato is that corruption got to a point that it just exceeded the country's tolerance. And eventually the country demanded some changes, and through a lot of institutional frameworks, those changes were made. But I think that transition, there's not going to be a point in time that Lava Jato is going to be officially over. Probably there will be, or there may not be. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a long-standing process. And what's at the core, it is really transparency. And I'll finish with just really literally reading the last sentence of our article, which is we're saying it is through transparency, though not transparency alone, that we can continue the long process of building a more honest democracy and a more just economy. In other words, this is going to take a lot of effort. We think transparency is at the core. Why? Because when people are, as Fernando pointed out, when people are registered to be lobbyists, at least we know who the players are. When people have to disclose their financial contributions, at least we know who is speaking with their wallets. And when we have a free press, we include that scrutiny. I don't think any of these things are on its own going to solve it, but we think that the active ingredient in all of this is transparency. So Milton, back to you.
Thank you, Joel. It's fantastic. And I really appreciate your remarks about that. Matthew Taylor was really the first author we invited, Fernando and myself, to be part of this book. His enthusiasm encouraged us to move forward. And that has an explanation, because Matthew is a fantastic academic, and he works in Brazil, in the University of São Paulo, and works studying Brazilian institutions that face all the aspects that are involved in corruption and how to avoid it. So please, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Somebody had to do that. Thank you for the invitation, Milton, and thank you also, Fernando, for involving me in the project. I think I'm a little bit of an odd bird in the project because I'm not thinking so much about lobbying, but I hope to draw out some of the ties to, especially to what Joel just said about transparency. So, I was rereading the Portuguese version of the book this morning and just trying to think about my remarks. And in some more recent work that I've done with a colleague named Luciano da Hoz, we started calling the combination that is commonly referred to as one of the sources in Brazil as the perilous combination. And that's a combination of coalitional presidentialism, fairly weak campaign finance enforcement, and this state-centric crony capitalism that Joel referred to. I was impressed in rereading the book by Lazzarini and Musacchio's wonderful chapter, which I think does a great job of looking at the third pillar of that perilous combination and the extent to which, even under the privatizations of the 1990s, the state was able to maintain a fairly influential role in the economy. And so this, I think, is important as we're thinking about lobbying and more broadly about corruption. And I'm not equating the two, but first thinking about lobbying and secondly, thinking about corruption. It's important for us to think about how Brazil is different from other large federal democracies, such as the United States. And so that perilous combination that I referred to, this combination of campaign finance, of coalitional presidentialism, and of a very strong state role in the economy, I think creates conditions on the ground that are quite different from those we see in the United States. And at the time that I wrote the draft chapter for Milton and Fernando, we were kind of evaluating Rousseff's waning administration. At the time, it was kind of clear that something was going to happen. But I was trying to think about corruption in Brazil in terms of a cresting wave. I think that would be the best metaphor. There had been, Joel talks about only time can tell, but I think that if we looked back at that time, 30 years into the past, the sea change in the ability to fight corruption in Brazil was marked. And, there were new institutions, there was new capacity, the budgets of accountability agencies in the federal government had increased markedly. There was, incredible new numbers of staff. And so it didn't seem all that surprising that Lava Jato would emerge. And in fact, one of the questions that I was trying to address in the chapter was the extent to which the reforms that we had been waiting for a long time, reforms that would carry forward accountability, would actually come to fruition. And so the chapter looked at some of the pressures and counter pressures. And, I think, as always, when we're looking at a large country, you can look at it as the glass half full. Sometimes it's the glass half empty. But the article was trying to evaluate what Dilma Rousseff in particular, but presidents before her, had been able to accomplish in terms of reform. And I think that the lobbying reform would fit here. And so when we look back at from a generational perspective, Brazil has really made huge strides. But the pushback, and I would argue since this book came out in Portuguese, has perhaps even increased. And, just to highlight a couple of points here, not only were many of the reforms that Dilma Rousseff put forward under enormous public pressure. Remember the demonstrations of 2013, the crazy election of 2014, Lava Jato in 2015, impeachment 2016. I mean, the story of the past decade has been remarkable. And so it would be surprising if we had gotten all of the reforms we wanted. I guess the question is, did we get even the minimal reforms that we would have wanted to see? And here, I think we need to think not just about transparency. I know that lobbying and transparency those are two terms that go together, and I agree with Joel that we should think about them together. But I think that we also need to think about the broader framework of accountability, which includes not just transparency, but also oversight and the possibility of sanction, of punishing wrongdoing. And so this is probably more relevant to the study of corruption than to the study of interest groups, because what interest groups do is not necessarily corrupt. And I agree with Joel that the important thing here is to keep our eye on transparency. But the fact of the matter is that even transparency, which I would argue is the place where Brazil is most advanced of those three sectors, transparency, oversight, and sanction, even transparency has been rolled back in the last, I think if we wanted to start it, we could date it to about 2016. The judiciary has imposed new rules on secrecy in major cases, including Lava Jato. State-owned enterprises that were really being pressured to open up have been able to shut back down. A former student of mine, Marcio Cunha Filho, who has shown the extent to which freedom of information laws are being essentially stonewalled by the bureaucracy. And I think we've seen most recently that Bolsonaro has begun to classify more and more things. He's imposed new rules in that regard. So this is in the area where Brazil was doing best. In the areas where it wasn't doing as well, oversight and particularly sanction, it's actually moved backward. And this is quite concerning, I think. In terms of oversight, I think the best data I can provide is one little statistic about the Financial Intelligence Unit in Brazil. This is the unit that goes after alleged money laundering, right? And this unit in Brazil is known as COAF. COAF has seen its budget cut by 3/4 in the last year. So 75%, and it was transferred around. You may recall that a Supreme Court Justice, Toffoli, basically said that the Financial Intelligence Unit could no longer, its data could no longer be used by other accountability agencies. And then in terms of sanction, I think that the things that worry me here probably worry all of us, but there have been a number of Supreme Court decisions in Brazil that seem to walk back many of the reforms that seem to make accountability more likely, changing the jurisdiction of different courts, sending all election-related, and this is important, sort of politically related campaign finance accusations that involve money laundering, removing them from the specialized anti-money laundering courts and sending them to the very weak and not very functional electoral courts. And then some decisions on things like the use of plea bargains and appeal jailing on appeal. So the overall picture, I think, today is a little bit more negative than it was when we wrote this as recently as a couple of years ago. But the overall logic, I think, is important to keep in mind of this relationship, because I think it helps us to understand why lobbying is as broad a subject as it is, and why it's so important to be studied in a context in which corruption is a huge challenge and accountability is an even larger challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, it's really it's a point of attention to see how things are going in Brazil related to some advances we have in the past, but for sure we have challenges in front of us. And to talk a little bit about the American experience and also the chapter they wrote in the book, I invite, it's an honor for us, Ana Prusa, that is a new head of the Brazil Institute in the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I would take this opportunity to thank you, Anya, for all the initiatives to have this event in this present edition. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Milton. I want to begin by saying on behalf of the Wilson Center and the Brazil Institute that it has been a real privilege to partner with INSPER and with the Brava Foundation and Jota on this book and this event. And it's been a real joy to work with all of you as well. So Paulo Sotero and I co-authored a chapter in the book that looked at lobbying in the United States. And we selected this as a comparison for Brazil because lobbying has been regulated in the United States for a long time now. And we felt it offered, some interesting lessons, both the good and the bad, what works and what really hasn't. In the United States, as in Brazil, lobbying is a dirty word. This is something you've been hearing repeatedly through this event, and I'm sure we're going to say it again. There is this perception among the public that lobbying is somehow corrupt because it involves money, because it involves influence. And yet lobbying has this really important function within a democratic system. It is the way that people and other entities, press the government for certain policies. And that can be done by businesses, but it can also be done by grassroots organizations or even individuals, right? So when we talk about lobbying, we're not just talking about, big corporations and backroom deals, right? It's really important to view lobbying within this wider framework of, the discussions between society, business, and the government on what public policies should be. So this leads to the question really of what should that engagement look like, right? What is the best way to have these conversations? And as Joel and Matthew expressed, transparency is really fundamental to this. And the US system of regulating lobbying is really premised on this idea of transparency and the idea that because lobbying is a legal activity guaranteed under the US Constitution, and that it involves, businesses, professional associations, civic, religious groups, grassroots movements, all of this should be carried out in the open, that we should be aware of who is trying to influence what. But as Matthew was talking about in Brazil, transparency is not enough, right? It is the basic structure that you need, but there also needs to be some form of accountability, some form of enforcement. And I think this is where the US system has struggled somewhat, where the US system of lobbying is largely based on this idea that companies will disclose, lobbyists will disclose voluntarily their actions, and there are, penalties in the code, but enforcement of those penalties has not been consistent over the years, right? And so what we see is that among the businesses and the entities that do disclose through the Lobbying Disclosure Act, that they tend to file their reports on time, they tend to provide the information that's needed, right? So among the actors that are fulfilling their requirements under the law, they're actually doing a good job of it. But that leads, other individuals and entities who are perhaps not disclosing. And what we found within the US system is that it has been very hard for the US government to figure out who is not disclosing, right? It's much easier to go after the people who are already reporting for whatever infractions they may have committed, rather than to try to figure out, who isn't even filing. And so in some ways that has created a perverse disincentive where if you're only doing a little bit of lobbying, or you think you can get away with not disclosing, there is this perverse incentive perhaps to not disclose under the law. This has changed to some extent recently, especially if we're looking at lobbying on behalf of foreign governments or foreign entities. Because of the Mueller investigation, actually, where he secured a number of convictions against people for violating the foreign disclosure requirements, we've actually seen an uptick, right, in companies and individuals who are now filing and disclosing all of the information that they need to. And so I think this is almost a perfect example of how you need, the two arms, right? You need to have transparency, and this is done through stating the types of information and the types of contacts between government officials and those who are seeking their influence, making that public. But then you also have to have the other arm, which is making sure that companies and individuals are adhering to those rules. And so I think, that's really at the core of the US experience, right? Where the laws are intended to promote transparency, but only when there is also enforcement do you see that that companies and individuals are fully reporting their activities and adhering to the law in a way that makes lobbying activities truly transparent. And all of this is at the national level, right? At the state level, within the United States, each state has its own definition of what a lobbyist is and what those activities are. And so it can actually get a little complicated, to figure out who is a lobbyist at the state level and who isn't, because it can vary from Florida to Mississippi to California. But what we have seen in recent years, and I think this is really interesting, is that a lot of the money involved in lobbying, a lot of the big lobbying firms are increasingly moving to state-based operations. And part of this has been linked to gridlock here in Washington, D.C. If we think of lobbying as being, an effort to influence policies, if policies aren't being passed, there's not much work to be done, right? And so we're seeing that as states have become more active as policymakers, as the federal government here in the US has passed fewer policies, that the money in lobbying is increasingly moving to the states. And then the last thing that I want to note when we're talking about lobbying in the United States, because I think this is relevant to Brazil as well, is that lobbying in some ways benefits from more Byzantine government structures, right? The harder it is to engage directly with the government, the more space there is for lobbyists to come in and to help companies and to help other entities interact with the government, right? Because they are the experts, they know how this is done, they have the connections. And so if you're thinking about how to make lobbying more transparent and more fair, I do think it's important to also look at, the way a government functions, how efficient is it, how hard is it to navigate, because that also has an impact on the lobbying industry. So I want to turn it over next to my co-author for the chapter, Paulo Sotero, currently a distinguished fellow here at the Brazil Institute and our former director.
Thank you, Anya. And before to give the floor to Paulo, I would like to say some words about Paulo, because Paulo, in fact, was the first support we received to do the project. So Paulo invited us to work under the Wilson Center umbrella to the Brazil Institute. In that opportunity, Paulo was the head of the Brazil Institute. And we work in the first meeting was in his office. And well, it's a big pleasure because Paulo is American Brazilian, so he knows everything about Brazil, everything about the politics in the United States. So for us Brazilians that know Paulo, he is our antenna that we have in the United States to know how things are going. So Paulo, please, I invite you for your remarks about your chapter and all the things, because you know all the projects. It's our honor to have you here with us.
Milton, thank you very much. Hi, guys, and hi, Anya. This is a real pleasure. I think this collaboration was one of the most fruitful, one of the most important that we had in my almost 14 years as director of the Brazil Institute. And I think our chapter that Anya just described aged very well. But I think, especially if we have change in government, both in the administration, in the Senate next week in the United States, as I believe we will have, I think the story is to be continued. As we highlighted in the chapter, the Trump administration came in promising to drain the swamp meaning the place where the lobbyists obviously worked with corrupt intent. That was the implication of his statement. What has happened in the past 4 years, and I would like to cite here as soon as I find it, about that. The swamp has not been drained. The swamp has probably been enlarged. There put probably some fencing around the swamp because access, I believe, is more restricted to people that are really associated with the administration. ProPublica, which is a wonderful nonprofit newsroom here in the United States, did an investigation with the Columbia University School of Journalism. They have an investigative unit now to measure, how what happened to the swamp of lobbyists. It was not much of a surprise. They found that in comparison with the first 6 years of the previous administration, the Trump administration, during the Trump administration, especially during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, there were one lobbyist for every 14 political appointees, which is 4 times more than in the 6 initial years of the Obama administration that had 2 terms. I believe that what's going to come, it's lots of studies, lots of investigation and research about this period that hopefully I think is ending. American lawyers, American officials, American scholars of ethics and government will examine this phenomenon. It seems all indications are that corruption has increased, went up, despite all the regulations, but we have a way of knowing that. I believe that there will be lots of reports, press reports. They started already, but they will continue to be produced. There will be lots of studies about how the swamp that was supposed to be drained has probably more than doubled in size. And this will be actually relevant for a continued collaboration, which I proposed between our colleagues, Milton, Fernando, and all of the others that are interested in this, because, well, the two countries are in a very different situation from that that existed when we started this project. Brazil, it's, I believe, more uncertain than the United States. I may be completely wrong, but I don't believe that it is Pollyannish to make this prediction that I am making. It's based on, a serious opinion polls and what you see from actually the itinerary of the two candidates in this last week. It looks like we are going to have important change in the United States. I am a little bit afraid at what could happen in this transition in the next few days. Actually, there is lots of apprehension on both sides and among officials. We could see here things that we had never seen before in terms of tension, and I think even in terms of violence. But the fact is that I may be wrong, but I believe that there will be new information about what happened to lobbying during this period that I hope to be coming to an end. And this will be, and in Brazil, I believe, from what I read and observe, I think the effort to, to regularizar lobby, to make it more transparent, etc. I think we are in a moment of setback. We are going backwards, not forward, but the necessity of collaborating stays, and I hope that information coming out will justify a continued collaboration and maybe an updating of the book in a few years. Before that, we can certainly, in terms of the work that Anya and I produced, we can certainly produce a less ambitious update in the next few months and publish it in journals or in Jota to keep the conversation going. But I think this collaboration was a successful one, and we should insist in continuing to work on it. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulo. And I know the worries that you mentioned comes from all of us, because it's very important to keep the characteristics of a transition, or a peaceful transition that's part of the political characteristics. So we are very worried, looking for the next days in the United States. Let me ask now Anya to help us on the questions we got from the audience. Anya, could you help us and say the questions that we probably received? I don't have conditions to see the questions, but I know you have.
Yes, so we've received a couple questions, and just a reminder for those watching, you can send questions to us by email at brazil@wilsoncenter.org. That's Brazil with a Z. And you can also tweet us questions. Our handle is @BrazilInst, INST. So one question we got is on the relationship between campaign finance and lobbying. And the question is specifically, lobbying can be done without money changing hands, right? And certainly if you're paying for an outcome, if it's a quid pro quo, that gets into corruption. So what is being done in Brazil to separate campaign finance from the act of lobbying?
Fernando?
I might take a shot of that start. So, well, first thing, I'm not sure if all the audience is aware, but private contributions in campaigns in Brazil are not in place anymore, right? Since a decision of the Supreme Court. So, and we do have a large public financing part in Brazil. We still have personal contributions in Brazil, but I think it's different than the US. It's not very common, right? So we don't have that much financing, but and there we also see some corruption indications. So just recently, we can see that a lot of people who received the financial support during the pandemic, very poor people were contributing to campaigns, right? I'm also writing a paper on very poor people who receive houses from the government, who also end up contributing to campaign. This has nothing to do with lobbying, but comes back to this point that Matthew was starting to talk, right? I think when we think about lobbying, and one of the things that I'm trying to currently work on, we can think about, let's say, politics as usual, right? You give money and you are receiving something on the other end. But we also have something that I like to call politics as unusual when you try to lobby on other aspects, right? And so some hypotheses are that lobbyists can pressure with knowledge, right? So we are in the private sector, we know what's happening, and so here is information. And we saw that when I was thinking about Matthew's and Paulo Sotero's remarks, one of the things that got to my mind is that we have this situation where the state is so important for companies in Brazil, right? So we have that situation that Matthew talked about. You have transparency, but also maybe sometimes lack of punishment, right? And today we have an extra situation, which is budgetary problems, right? Budgetary constraints in Brazil. And so the fight for the pie is really, really strong at this point, right? So we saw lobbying groups going to Brasilia, and that I don't know if Milton know about these things, or Paulo in the past, but having campaigns and headquarters in Brasilia during the pension reform, right? Next year, we have ahead of us another dispute on the pie, which is the tax reform, right? Where interests are going to be much more different interests. And if we lead this, let's say, politics as usual, where you have a private interest and you use your power or your financial power to steer tax breaks into your direction, we might have very troublesome problems next year with the tax reform, right? At the same time, it's a very important time for these reforms to go back to economic growth in Brazil. So when Paulo's talked about worrisomes of stepping backs, and Matthew talks about some worrisomes in step backs in terms of corruption fighting, I would say that we need to pay attention to this huge reform that is coming. So we don't have money transparency coming to campaigns anymore, but we do have lobbying and this relationship becoming more and more important. And I would say, let's pay attention to the tax reform next year.
Okay.
Right. And I would add to that actually that in the United States, it is quite different, right, than in Brazil, where Brazil, you have a lot of limits on personal campaign contributions, and companies cannot contribute anymore. But in the US, I mean, we had the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling that really blew open campaign finance in terms of private sector contributions, right, where there are still limits on what each individual can give to the candidate or to the specific campaign. But there's really no limits in some respects on what you can give to political action committees or some of these other groups that are affiliated with the parties and the campaigns and running ads on behalf of the campaigns, but are not subject to some of these rules. And so within the United States, we saw after the Citizens United ruling that there was this increasing pressure among lobbyists and government relations professionals to donate to campaigns. And so I think what you see there, right, is that, you know, campaign finance in the United States has certainly shaped the way politicians act. There's more pressure to get more money because there is more money in politics. And that's also shaped the pressures that the lobbying industry feels.
Anya, this is Joel. If I just add one item here, I think, you know, it may end up being an academic exercise, but I think both the US and Brazil are experimenting with things that are going to be very, very telling, I think, for just all of society in the coming years. One is, you know, whereas the US has kind of, as you talked about, has a much more, some would say, unlimited financing system. In Brazil, you know, as Fernando was pointing out, there's been some restrictions, but what you end up having is the government financing, providing appropriations from the budget to parties. And, you know, I remember from my poli-sci classes, and I would think many of us understand the dynamics that creates, the power that adds to political parties, and to those in power as opposed to those outside of powers. So I think, you know, I know Matthew talked about, you know, the form of the Brazilian governmental structure also matters. I think there's a lot of elements there for us to explore in the coming months and years, honestly, as to what their impact. My personal view is sort of from watching, I'm not quite sure that one or the other is solving the problem. That's why I sort of come from a much more vision is we're going to have money in politics. It's too much is at stake, too many people, and unless you're going to restrict people's rights, it's going to be very hard. So I think that's one of the things. And in Brazil, this public finance in a campaign, to me, I think is really interesting. I think some would argue there is a certain cronyism even inside the way that money gets allocated, because at the end of the day, those in Congress are actually appropriating the money to themselves.
Yeah.
If I could piggyback here, do we have time, Anya?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think Joel, well, you both were onto something. I guess a couple other things I would add here. One is, you know, before the ban on corporate finance contributions, it was often common to refer to the relationship as a gentleman's agreement, you know, that firms would give money, but it wasn't a quid pro quo. It was just to have a particular, you know, group of legislators who would pay attention when they came knocking. But Joel mentioned a couple of experiments that are going on. I mean, another experiment that will be interesting to watch is the effect of the end of so-called coligações at the state level. And what that does is, so basically coligações are inter-party alliances at the local level. And one question is, with them being split up, what happens to inter-party electoral competition? And this is one of the sources, I think, of a lot of the lack of transparency in campaign finance generally, is that you have an incentive. You're not running only against the other party, you're also running against your peers in the party.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this helps to explain another facet of Brazilian politics, which is different from the American, which is the existence of these large, well, I guess it's not so different, but the existence of these large caucuses, the so-called bancadas. Anyway, I think that the comparison is a great one and one that we should continue to build upon. But I think that, as Joel said, money is going to keep finding its way into politics, and it's the different structures of the politics that are going to channel it in ways that are either appropriate or not. In that context, it seems to me that, you know, the more transparency that we have for lobbying, the more that wrongdoing will go into other realms. And, you know, that's not to say that I think it's a great idea that it should get out of lobbying to the extent that it's there and move instead into other realms that are actually probably subject to more oversight.
Very good.
And this inter-party competition, it's, well, there is some evidence that this drives the cost of campaigns up, right, Professor? Because you are competing with your peer there, and since the district is so large in Brazil, different from the U.S., right? Many times you are competing in the whole district, in the whole state, and so campaign costs goes way up.
So we have another question that asks, you know, how effective is lobbying in Brazil right now? And this is from a student who did a dissertation at King's College on lobbying in Brazil, and asking, you know, Brazil has a history of clientelism and corruption in the government and between the government and you know, state businesses and the private sector. So to what extent are the more legal types of lobbying actually being used and are actually effective at influencing policymaking in Brazil?
I'll take a stab at that, Anya, just to get us started. You know, I think if you asked even the same question about in the U.S., I would say really you can't answer that question at the country level or even at a sector level. Probably at the company, not the country level, is the only way we can look at its effectiveness. Because if one would say, you know, and then remember what most of what lobbying is doing is often, at least from, I would say, from the corporate lobby, tends to be to stop action, not to take action. Anybody who's been involved in this knows it's a lot easier to kill a bill than to get a bill passed. And so this becomes a, you know, the measure of effectiveness, I think I would question. And I think at the end of the day, it would be an exercise that I'm not sure, you know, if it's effective or not in Brazil versus the United States. What does it mean? I think once you look at the company, and what I would say, what we really would like to, I would say we need to see more is, you know, a correlation between successful companies and, you know, let's say fair lobbying, open advocacy, and not just, you know, and I think that many of us think that lobbying is kind of this silver bullet, it's great. You know, any successful company that is engaged in, our air quotes here, lobbying, whether it's legitimate, whether it's regulated or not, is doing a lot more than what most people would consider lobbying. So, you know, whether it's an advertisement campaign for a beer company, whether it is a tobacco company trying to fight regulations in terms of it, all of that I would say is in one way or another lobbying. How to measure that effectiveness, I think you need a lot of time. The issue is, and Milton used this phrase in the beginning, is as most companies have learned, the old saying, I think it's from Washington here in DC, but who knows where it really got started. If you're not at the table, in other words, if you're not in Washington lobbying or Brasilia lobbying, you're going to be on the menu. So it's really a defensive mechanism. And if you're, you know, I would say then you're really measuring the company's ability to defend itself or defend its ability to continue doing business.
Oh, sorry. Please, Professor.
Fernando.
No, I just want to add something, and I thought Joel's comments were really, really important. I have actually a working paper that I present in some Congress that tries to measure two things. First, there is a paper in American Journal of Political Science this year that the author measures lobbying in the European Union, and there is one important differentiation, right? Sometimes you lobby alone, sometimes you lobby as a coalition. As she puts, lobbyists are not solitary wolves. Sometimes you go in packs, right? And so I ran a field experiment measure with a treatment and control group in Congress in Brazil during the pension reform, right? And I found an effect of 3.5 percentage points when you show that you are a coalition, when you show that you are working together and you have political power and economical power, in a sense that you are showing that this is a coalition, right? And so, but these are not, first of all, these are not very common situations, because you need to deal with a collective action problem to sit on the table beforehand and do your lobbying as a coalition, right? So the measure I found in a very specific, very important bill, right? Very highlighted, everyone discussed it, was 3.5 points of a successful campaign, right? But again, there are types and types, right? There are these lone wolves and this working as in pack, right? And 3.5%, we might think that is not very much, but we also might think that this is around 30 votes that can change the outcome of an important bill. Right?
I just want to add something on top of Joel and Fernando's observations. I take the reference that Matthew did on the chapter written by Sergio Lazzarini and Aldo Musacchio about the state, the dimension and centrality of a state in Brazil. So if we discuss effectiveness of lobbying, it's important to know that it's practically impossible to do a development process in a big company, in a small company, in a medium-sized company, in each company, if you do not deal with the officials, with the state, in many and different kind of relationships. So you must. In this way, lobbying is part of a strategy that is a must-have strategy in the company. You need to have that in order to create situations that you can deploy to your process in your development process inside the company. You have different aspects. Fernando mentioned one of the aspects. I can mention another one. If you have a company that you need to create a process for an innovative process, let's say a simple thing, that is the Uber company that is discussing in the cities how to create a norm and legislation about Uber and how to deal with the cabs in the same city. This is it's a global problem. You have this problem in New York, in Los Angeles, in Washington, in Berlin, and in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and others. So the companies know much more than the public officials about the issue. So the relationship is good for both, and it's good for the society as well. So you have a lot of effectiveness in lobbying when you discuss innovative aspects. If you go to the health area, what to say about vaccines and other things. So I think that the response for the question is yes, it's effective, and there is a lot of facets that you have to understand and to create situations to avoid corruptions and other misbehaviors in this area. Paulo, you raise your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to make one remark about what I'm seeing here as I try to convey. I am more on the hopeful. You could accuse me of being Pollyannish about this. I believe that the United States will enter a phase now of deep reflection and about what just happened in this country. And I think the country will overcome. Thinking about that, I think we are going to see in the United States in the coming years enormous creativity, enormous energy to make the system more open, more democratic, more transparent, etc., including in this area. Okay. Now, I see the same thing, although we are all kind of depressed in Brazil. I see the same thing happening in local, state, and local governments in Brazil. We keep focusing on Brasilia, on the antics of the government, the federal government, etc. But there is lots of new voices, officials in states, in cities in Brazil, and we had a taste of that the other day. Anya led a seminar about smart cities and how do you manage and how do you move forward. And I knew some of that already, but I was very impressed with the quality of the people, the Brazilian officials in state and local governments, working on public policy. So I think that there is here another opportunity for collaboration, especially if I am right, and if starting next Tuesday, we will see, actually not starting next Tuesday, starting in 2018, we saw a renewal of political class in Congress here. I think that process will continue, will deepen, and providing lots of opportunities for dialogue, cooperation, collaboration between Brazilian and Americans in different areas, but especially in municipal, local governments. I think this is an area that's promising, and I leave this as a suggestion.
Very good.
Thank you. So I think that leads into another question that we received, which is, what appetite is there in Brazil right now to continue the process of regulating lobbying as a profession, as an industry in Brazil? The kind of push to root out corruption in some ways has slowed down. Has that also happened to this push to regulate lobbying?
Fernando, you want to start since you're closer there on the day-to-day?
Well, I would go back to that data I presented. So I think that the opportunity was higher in 2016, that there was a discussion. The urgency of the bill was voted, meaning that it could be voted any week and stay there for a couple of months, and then they knock it down. So the model shows a 50-50% with an increase in the last few weeks, but that's also a feature of the machine learning model, because at this point in pandemic, any movement in a bill, the model considers, there is an increasing chance there, because the way the Congress is voting on bills now has changed due to the pandemic, right? So I would say 50-50 is a very optimistic perspective. I don't see that being discussed to be in the agenda at this point. But I mean, Maya is a pro-business. We do have some congressmen who think it's an important bill, and so agenda setting would be an important issue. So someone would have to bring this back to the table.
Could I jump in just for a second? I think I remember Joel when we presented the book the first time, and please forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth that are not yours, but somebody wise at our last seminar on this book said, you know, there's kind of an incentive against this bill moving forward because if you get it right, you'll be criticized, but the likelihood of it's being gotten wrong is very high. And, you know, this is something that we've seen in a number of bills in going through the Brazilian Congress. I'm reminded of another case, which was the central bank independence, where I remember Persio Arida talking about this at a seminar a few years ago, where he said, you know, at the former central bank president, he said, we came up with a bill for central bank independence, and we really wanted to push it through. And in a universe in which we didn't have any other bills and any other legislation to worry about, it would have gone through. But there were so many ways in which Congress could leverage the bill to make things worse that, you know, there's sort of a political economy problem of incentive structures that's very hard to get around. And so the window of opportunity in 2016, 17, 18 looked a little bit better than perhaps it does right now, and especially because of all the other legislation that's being pushed through or being attempted right now.
Matthew, I don't know if I said that. I'll let the others try to decipher if it was smart. The audience thinks it's smart. I'll take credit, but honestly, not quite sure. But what I think, just to add to this, you know, and by the way, we can also imagine that depending on a scenario of U.S. elections, the next year here in Washington, there's going to be a big push to change a lot of these, let's call them oversight responsibilities. I think largely from the experience of, I think as many of us have come to appreciate, not just in this administration, but there's been some others as well, that a lot of the laws in the U.S. were written never thinking that the head of state or cabinet members really needed to be comply with some rules, because nobody ever, you know, sort of in that America, call it Pollyannish, nobody ever thought that there would be a problem of that of this magnitude in terms of trust in government. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the United States. Going back to Brazil, you know, I'm of the view that less is better in terms of laws and regulations, and the reason is, and that's why I defend much more of a transparency, disclose everything, as opposed to trying to create very clear rules. Because I think what Fernando's data actually shows is, you know, when you create this incentive to register in Brasilia right now, I have a suspicion that, you know, I've come to learn that, for instance, one of the good things of being registered in Brasilia is you get to go into the Congress, you get a special card, a special credential. And so then it becomes like, well, then you've basically said, okay, these guys can go there and advocate. Well, what about, you know, back to Milton's points, the individuals, not the collective, not the lobbyists, professional lobbyists. What about the individual who wants to lobby on behalf of whether it's his community or just he feels passionate about an issue? You start segregating it, which is why I think, you know, judges love to say that the doors of the courts are open to everybody. I think, you know, especially our legislative and our executive, we need to keep reminding ourselves of that, which is why you look in the US experience, all of the changes have really been, and I think the successful changes have been around freedom of information, open meetings and regulatory process. That's key. I think that's an area I think Brazil has come a long way. I think it can go further, but I'm much more of a, you know, maybe it's a blessing in disguise that they didn't pass that law.
And so that actually dovetails nicely with the last question we received, which is, if you're looking at a piece of legislation that is passed in Brazil, and they gave the example of PLP 244, which is a grants tax exemption for defense forces and public security. But when you're looking at, you know, legislation, is there a way to track who is attempting to influence that legislation? Is there a way to figure out who has been involved in kind of informing and crafting that bill in Brazil right now? Does anyone know?
I literally, as you said that, I Googled that PLP and I saw that I won't say the name of the trade association, was taking a position on it publicly. So there's always Google, right? I mean, there's always the transparency element. I think you bring a good point. I think this is where, the public comment process in Brazil can be improved. Brazil has done a very good job, I think, maybe excessive in terms of disclosing the schedules of public figures, right? We've had a few cases where the names of people who were disclosed on executive schedules have compromised some let's call it intelligence officials in the past in Brazil. I think I think Congress has a long way in Brazil to be more transparent. We're very good at finding out how much money a congressman is spending, but it's much harder, I would say, to understand where a congressman stands on an issue and where those coalitions, I think, give some advertisement here to Jota. I think Jota does a great job of improving that, but I think we could do better at that. And really just opening up the Brazilian Congress more than it is, not just online, but in terms of access and public debate.
Yeah, and Paulo?
Now, there is one thing, Richard, about the question, right? There is one way of tracking and of monitoring and so on. It's called journalists. Please keep good journalists informed about what's going on, because that's the surest way to keep the system honest. Or I don't know, it's not sure, but it is what is available. And I think it's that, on the one hand, trust journalists and obviously identify the good ones, and we know who they are, and we all know who they are. And the other thing is what was in the previous question. Yes, please, let's work against and avoid the carteirinhas. Careful, because in Brazil we have this, I think it's probably genetic, at least from Getúlio Vargas, since Getúlio Vargas, we love a carteirinha. We love that if someone presents the idea, there will be a carteirinha to be a lobbyist. As, for instance, we know that coming from those new schools of international relations, that they wanted to create a profession for that, people that coming from those universities. We have to work against this mentality in Brazil or anywhere, but since we are focused on Brazil, of making things more open and more transparent. And in this activity, it is important. I believe that Jota does a very good job in that space. I believe that many in the Brazilian media and in certain other spaces, virtual or not. And yes, but it requires effort to, I always said that when people would for many years at GW, I used to do an annual lecture on how to, help Brazilian officials produce good public policy, etc. The late James Ferrer that started this, and I always told them, please identify good journalists, build relationships with good journalists, because they are the conduits to this public debate, and they can do wonderful work. They have been doing. So this is my answer to that question and my suggestion to the whole group.
May I add two things to what Paulo, to Paulo's point? So we have a couple of stories in the press in the past few years where journalists got the bill that is sponsored by deputies, famously Eduardo Cunha, for instance, and look at the information of the Word documents and discover who actually wrote that document and was a company or so that's one way that is always there. You go to the Word options, what is this information about this document, and you can see who made the change, and so there are a couple of very good articles done by that. Another thing that is increasingly a strong community of data scientists, and the Congress is making an effort to create open source, and so we use that in our tools in Jota, and that's not without trouble, right? Last week, the Senate changed one of these source of information and change it completely the way they release, and so you have to change all your codes to get that information, and so every week we have some trouble like that. But the information that is available today is very good to track every step of the way of a bill, and we can transform that in some tools for people to use. That's the type of data we use in our predictive models, but there is no information about what the question asks. Okay, who lobbied or which group with interest group send that information or ask to change or something like that. So that's not present there, right? And I saw that a couple of weeks ago, CGU also released API on public agendas for ministers, secretaries, which is also a good way to check who. And I know a study that has been made that just looking into the agendas of secretaries, ministers, that most of the agenda is dominated by a small group of organizations. So that's another way. But very clear responding the question, it's you can check every step of the way in a bill. That's the Congress is really good, the data, but who asked for a change there or, and also in Brazil, there is something that is really difficult because many changes are done on the floor at the day of the voting. And so Paulo is completely right. Having a journalist there on the floor, that no model is going to get, no artificial intelligence, because they are literally writing on the bill and changing the text on the bill. And many times this change many things. Yeah.
Let me just be contrarian just a little bit. I know, Anya, we're going to wrap up here in a second. You know, I started by talking about the benefits of sunlight as a disinfectant, you know, transparency. I just want to, you know, remember us, there's the flip side of this, you know, when I believe, in my personal view, that, you know, if you put too much, well, let's put it this way, if you put too much sunlight on certain plants, they die. And I think there's a certain bit of, we have to recognize that there's a certain level of discourse, of debate, of, you know, as people would say, you know, the sausage making of government. Everybody loves sausage. Nobody wants to know how it's made, but there's a certain part of that I think we do still need it. We need, you know, I'm not defending, and I want to be very clear. So we need to understand that that's going to happen. Just like a journalist is, you know, if a journalist had to disclose all of its sources, well, you know, that'd be full transparency. There wouldn't be journalism. And I think we just need to remind ourselves of that. The example I always give, Fernando, to this issue of putting the schedules out. Let's just say the CEO of a large company needs to meet with the finance minister to say, a bank, I have a massive problem. We're going to go bankrupt in a few days and we need a bailout. And let's just say, for argument's sake, this was a fair, nothing wrong with this. He couldn't have that meeting, because his meeting would be disclosed and immediately the market would react on that information. So I just give that as an extreme example of when sometimes that, you know, like I've said, transparency is good, but maybe too much can kill that plant.
Just on that point.
Very quickly, Paulo.
Yes, Paulo, please.
No, just one this. It's exactly that point. The too much sunlight, but you know, that's why it's so important that all of us helped and continue to help to identify good, well-meaning journalists, because the journalists, Joel, can be the filter. You have to all the sunlight, please, but put a journalist there and put well-meaning public servants and well-meaning people that will say, no, let's modulate this. And I think the journalist is one of the agents that does very well that important modulation.
And 30 seconds. And I also think that in Congress, this is a little bit different. My concern is when you have all this process, all this discussion, and you get on the floor and the thing is completely changed on the floor at the last minute, right? But that's a discussion for another time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have 5 minutes to go into an end of this fantastic meeting. I have the pleasure to be with my colleagues, and I learn a lot with them. And I hope that you enjoy this meeting and the launching of this edition. And I will ask Anya, if you could, Anya, to explain to all of us how to get the book, how to download the book, and what platform you can read the book in the English edition. Please, Anya.
Thank you, Milton. So right now, the book is available on the Wilson Center website. You'll see a link if you're watching on our website right below the video feed where you can get the book. And we'll send an email likely next week as we get it on a few other platforms for reading. But it's available right now as a PDF, and I would strongly encourage you check it out. In addition to chapters from all of the authors that we've had here today, there's several other chapters that I think do a really excellent job of explaining lobbying and the scenarios involving lobbying in Brazil. And there's also a really excellent second section that was co-authored by Milton Seligman, who's with us today, that discusses, the practicalities of government relations. How do you do it? What are some of the things that you should be thinking about? And I think that is also an excellent contribution to the field.
And I know that it's extremely expensive. Is that correct? The book is extremely expensive. Is that correct?
The book is free. The English book is free, yes.
Very
so
good.
Anyone who would like to access it, it is free, available for download, and we definitely want to thank INSPIR and the Brava Foundation for making that possible.
And the cover is very beautiful. I liked it more than the Brazilian edition. Yes.
Yes, and for those of you interested in the Portuguese edition, it is also still available. You can get it on Amazon, or if you're in Brazil, I see Matthew's holding it up. In Brazil, it's available at a number of bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have 2 minutes, so I give the floor for you to just to say goodbye, and I would like to thank you in advance for your time and to be here with us, and for the audience that follow us.
Whether you're in Brazil or in the United States, please vote in whatever election you have a chance to vote in. Doesn't matter who you vote for, I won't tell you, but please vote.
I'd like to inform you that Eloise and I already did.
Wow,
I could, if you think very hard, you may even guess our vote. We vote.
Yes. So a very important reminder that lobbying is not the only way to influence public policy.
Yes.
Oh, yes, that is. Fernando.
I just want to thank you, everyone.
Okay. Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you for having me as part of this great group, and thank you to the Wilson Center and to all the other sponsors.
Thank you to the Wilson Center, particularly to Anya that hosts this meeting, and she is absolutely responsible for to have the English edition. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fundação Brava, that support the costs of this edition, and thank you to INSPIR. And for sure, thank you to Jota, because Jota is raising the awareness on the issue, and it's very important discussion in Brazil. And thank you for the audience to having us in this, let's say, lunchtime in the United States, probably lunchtime also in Brazil. And thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Ciao.